Welcome back, everyone. Today I want to talk to you guys about the drastic changes taking place in the government, specifically regarding the Department of Government Efficiency, being DOGE. Now, it does appear to be a pretty controversial topic going around right now with all the changes and cuts going on that DOGE is trying to implement. But right now, their real true goal is to try to balance the federal government's budget when it comes to their tax revenue and government spending overall. As we've seen in recent years on the headlines with high inflation, we've seen a large increase in the national debt and interest on that national debt with higher interest rates as of lately. And this is simply seen as something unsustainable in recent years, and there's been a lot of public outcry. So it appears that the will of the people right now is to go ahead and allow Donald Trump and Elon Musk, who's running DOGE, to try to solve this problem. And right now, it appears DOGE has an 18-month lifespan, about 1 to 2 years until it is eliminated and their job is done. So we have a lot of watching and listening to do in terms of these changes that they're going to try to implement. So the purpose of this video is just to kind of give us a light understanding, at least in terms of what to watch and look for to see if DOGE will truly be successful. If we don't ultimately balance the government deficit, the spending problem, this problem will just get worse, and ultimately the bubble will burst in a more painful way longer term. And that either will be defaulting on the debt, resulting in extreme inflation, and just a really bad time overall for us as citizens of the United States. So, introduction here, the US government spending has ballooned to unprecedented levels, creating staggering national debt and a massive fiscal imbalance. To restore the budget, the DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, must take bold action to normalize spending to historical levels seen in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Now, I'm not sure we're going to get down to that level of spending or government size as it was over 100 years ago, but it is at least a theoretical target to keep in mind. That would take massive government cuts. Now, just as a historical measurement or a reference point, in the 1890s, the government spending as a percent of GDP was only about 3%. Up to the 1920s to modern day America, the number kept on rising slowly and slowly as we increased government spending on things like war infrastructure, Medicare, military expansion and defense, and things as such. And this increased spending has obviously ballooned the national debt to, I think, mid 30 trillions right now. We're approaching 40 trillion probably in the next 1 to 2 years, assuming everything stays the same. And this massive government spending has really upset the people as of recently, as I think a lot of folks have realized they're not getting back as much from the government as they're putting in. And this has led to DOGE, obviously, here. So the will of the people right now is to see some change, at least overall, even though some people might not like this. As the government functions, it operates at the will of the people. The more the people request from the government, the more the government's going to try to tax us and spend that tax dollars to try to satisfy the people. But obviously, there seems to be an imbalance right now in terms of the value that the average citizen is receiving from the government. And all this doesn't even take into account the tax and the spending from states, local governments through sales tax, property taxes, things like that, which is even larger in terms of what percent of your income goes towards taxes overall. So if we want to see DOGE be successful, we need to balance the budget and in a really ideal scenario, get it back down to where it was in the late 1800s, early 1920s, which might seem like an impossible task today. And in my opinion, probably is, and cutting that much would probably send us into a recession as so many people would lose their jobs and overall GDP would drop drastically. However, more pain would lie ahead if we don't do anything about it today. Really just looking here in terms of where all the I think it's roughly about $6 to $7 trillion of federal spending is going today. It's going to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, military, and interest on the debt, and a few other items. And all of these here are massive budget items. If we really wanted to see changes, we would have to look at these large items here like Social Security and Medicare, and these social items, which takes up massive amounts of money from the government. Now, I think that recently, obviously, people have demanded a lot from the government, and things like Social Security and Medicare, these were implemented many years ago under different demographics that existed back then, right? Social Security was never meant to be a full-blown retirement system for millions of people. It was also invented during a time where the demographics of America was much more healthy, and you had a lot more young people working than there were older people in retirement, sucking up their assets, selling off their investments, and relying on social security back then. It was just simply a lot more feasible back then versus today. Puts a lot more strain on current workers, and therefore the current workers, younger people, need to be taxed more, and it's simply not efficient anymore. And with current birth rates around 1.6, which is well below the replacement value needed of 2.1, to maintain the population is set to decline over the coming decades as older, larger generations die off and they're replaced with newer, smaller generations. So something needs to change, as a smaller workforce can't pay down this massive burden of a government debt and spending that we have grown accustomed to. So if we want DOGE to be successful, if we want to kind of like reference it to, where is that reference? And that's what we need to be watching. Right now, if government spending is around 20, 30, 40% of GDP, that is a huge number, and to make any changes to that would have drastic effects on GDP. Seriously looking here, if we're going to take DOGE seriously, and we want to assume a better, more fiscally responsible future for us all, we're going to probably have to see massive Social Security and Medicare cuts going forward, which would upset a lot of people, but it would simply have to be done. And overall, I mean, if we look at DOGE and their goal, if that's really what it is, that's what we need to see. If we don't see these cuts happen over the next few years, it's hard to argue and see and say that DOGE will have been successful if they don't make these drastic and very controversial cuts to the spending, as right now we are on an unsustainable path. So if we're to save these trillions of dollars, reduce the national debt, and make the future better for young people, we need to be watching these key items here, these massive portions, right? I think recently we've seen some cuts to USAID, foreign aid, and things like that, which if we've seen the headlines, you've looked at the numbers, that's only a few tens of billions of dollars, which, don't get me wrong, that's a lot of money, but it makes a very, very small dent in the overall problem going on here in the current government expenditure on for the citizens as a whole. So what we might have to see is a gradual retirement age increase. We need to see some efficiency improvements in the military. And I don't know how that all looks. Either people need to be laid off, government cuts need to be made in terms of salary decreases or such, or we need to automate more so in terms of the government and what they're doing. That means implementing more artificial intelligence, robotics, and things like that. Because right now, the people are simply demanding too much from the government, and DOGE is going to try to trim the fat down from the government spending overall to fix that problem. So if we are to balance the budget, right, look at where things need to go over time, we're going to have to see billions, probably about $1 to $2 trillion in cuts to the federal government spending each year going forward. So if, let's say right now, government spending is about $7 trillion, government tax revenue from a federal standpoint is close to about $5 trillion, we need to see $2 trillion cut from the government spending just to balance the budget. Now, making those cuts, yes, in the short term would be painful, but if we don't see that from DOGE, then their mission to right-size the government will have been a failure, very likely. Any government organization that spends more than they bring in over time is ultimately going to go bust or bankrupt or create hyperinflation in the event of the government. Unlike a regular business, right? If a regular business spends more money than they make and they're paying more interest on the debt than they can afford to over time, eventually that business will go bankrupt. However, right now, what the government is doing is operating like a business, but they can't actually go bankrupt because they can just print the money in a computer essentially through banks and the Federal Reserve System and just cause inflation, essentially just stealing money from people's hard-earned savings, depreciating the dollar to make up for the difference in not having enough government tax revenue to spend the money for the people's unlimited wants and needs that they're demanding from the government. So thus we have a large budget deficit. And with rising interest rates, this gets really, really hard to do. So what Elon Musk, DOGE, and basically America needs to decide on is giving DOGE the power to make these cuts and understanding at a core level what the objective is. Because if we keep kicking the can down the road, everyone loses. If we make the cuts in the short term, it'll be painful, very painful. Probably a recession will occur, but it would be far less damaging than the long-term scenario of hyperinflation and everyone's savings and investments just getting eroded away by a worthless dollar, which is what we're trying to avoid. Now, I think some other longer-term effects here could take place, or scenarios could take place that we aren't really foreseeing yet. And I don't think that if DOGE is unsuccessful, that we're going to see a large economic disaster happen in the short term. I think it's going to take about 10 to 20, maybe even 30 more years until the whole system cracks down and the bubble bursts if DOGE isn't successful in the short term. Which that would just be a hyperinflationary environment and everyone loses. So right now, we need to see government spending cut drastically by $1 to $2 trillion. Keep that number in mind. That is the key metric. If that doesn't happen, we don't balance the budget and things get worse. So to take DOGE seriously, that's what we have to see. Over time, yes, this will be painful, but the demographics can't support where we are currently, and the current tax system, if it goes any higher, you're looking about 20 to 50% of your income just going to taxes to fuel a larger and unhealthy government as it has been, which again, unsustainable. So yes, it will be painful, but where in this do we cut, and where does DOGE cut first? If we were to be in a society that has only 10% of GDP spent from the government, that goes back to the taxpayers, however that looks, we would have a much more free economy that is less reliant on the government. Back then, late 1800s, early 1920s, it was much more of a private market sector in terms of how GDP was made, right? Much more of the GDP was in the private sector rather than the government. Today, the government just makes up such a large percent of the GDP, which is a problem as we've become so reliant on it. It's sort of like a drug addict that's addicted to a drug and can't get off of it. Once you've started and you're addicted to whatever that drug is, the after effects, right? The hangover is very, very painful. So right now, the government is sort of, in a way, like a drug addict that can't stop doing its habitual drug, whatever that might be. So this is going to be painful. DOGE needs to make these massive cuts. And if DOGE only makes a few cuts of $100 billion here and there and nothing more, that'll have a somewhat of an impact, but nothing substantial enough long term. So that's the seriousness of what is going on here. And unfortunately, I don't believe the average person actually understands how much government spending and restructuring needs to take place. And I really wish that this was more well communicated to the average person. I wish DOGE, Trump, or whoever would put together a really well detailed presentation outlining exactly what the consequences are and are not if these changes are made, really just to be transparent with the people. I wish there was more of an explanation from DOGE and their team to give their objectives in a transparent manner to the people, really just in the form of like a PowerPoint presentation or whatnot, because it seems like we're really all lost on what their objective is other than to just cut. And the average person needs that transparency and that educational perspective from DOGE to not have a public uproar from towards DOGE when they make those cuts. If DOGE just goes ahead and makes massive cuts to Social Security, which millions of Americans rely on, that would have a massive uproar effect and would essentially just completely backfire, in my honest opinion. Therefore, we need an explanation and transparency on what is going to happen in the short term before DOGE does anything. Unfortunately, I think that's one of the missing keys here in terms of how DOGE is operating. I am watching DOGE and Elon Musk on X, on Twitter, right, former Twitter, X, in terms of what they're doing, and it all makes sense, and it's a good start. But the average person isn't watching it as closely. So I think that the average person, if as long as they're educated and they see the objective on DOGE, what they're doing, and the possible effects, the pros and cons of it long term, they would be much more receptive and easygoing with the hard process or government cuts that'll have to take place. It's all about transparency and honesty here with the American people. These are their tax dollars, and all of it will have a direct correlation or effect on their life, on all of us, especially long term. So here, I mean, if we look at the current, well, I think one of the other perspectives I wanted to share with you guys here was longer term, if we can get out of this. I mean, I think AI and robotics long term might be the actual logical solution to all of this in terms of getting rid of people in the workforce, in the government workforce specifically. And I don't mean this in the short term. I mean in the next 10 to 20, 30 years, if we replace much of the government operating systems with AI and robotics, right? If we can do that, we can drastically reduce the amount that we spend on Medicare and military and things like that. If we can automate the Medicare or the healthcare industry, we can spend less in the healthcare industry, thus reducing the amount needed from the government to support the average person with Medicare. If we can automate the military, all robotics it being ran by AI and things like that, at least a large portion of it, we can reduce government spending without having to drastically fire a whole lot of people today. Now, of course, in the short term, we will need those cuts, but longer term, if one of those two things happen, either we need drastic cuts today or some substantial cuts today with a lot of automation in the future. One of those two scenarios might make sense. But for the average person, again, this is very difficult to conceptualize. And fortunately, there's smart people in DOGE and the government right now looking to make things more efficient. But will it happen? That's the real thing that we need to be keeping a close eye on. And if we listen to other folks, economists and such, they are not too optimistic on these massive cuts. Having any of these cuts, like I mentioned before, would lead to a massive recession or depression style scenario, which would possibly decrease GDP, which would ultimately decrease tax revenues, which would be a downward spiraling effect, especially when you're paying large amounts of interest on the debt. So overall, again, in summary, I think we need to see at least a $1 to $2 trillion cut in the short term to take everything seriously. With that being said, thank you all so much for watching. Don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next video.